Morning, everybody. Welcome to day 8, the final day of hearing submissions on the centre zone provisions of the Wellington City District Plan. We have a full morning submissions, so I won't delay that process. I will ask that any cell phones are put on silent. No, usual morning. So, Mr. Ballinger, I take it you're leading the charge?
Yes, thank you, sir. Kia ora koutou, ko Duncan Ballinger tōku ingoa. I'm counsel for Wellington's Charitable Trust, and to my left here is Stuart Niven, who you were introduced to yesterday, who will be speaking on the City Outcomes contribution. And then our presentation is made jointly with Historic Places Wellington. So after Stuart and I have spoken, you'll hear from Ms Wong and Ms Mackay on their submission for Historic Places Wellington. I just wanted to highlight 2 points, one of which was in my legal submission, one of which is sort of related, but I didn't quite get there in my written legal submission. And these both relate to the wind chapter. So the first one, which I didn't flag in my written submission, is that Wellington's Charitable Trust supports the requirement or suggestion in the Section 42A report for there to be wind assessments in the high density residential zone. That was suggested in Kainga Ora's submission, and so there's scope to make that change, and we suggest that is a sort of logical consequence of the higher building heights that are anticipated in the high density zone. I just wanted to flag that. The second point on wind, which I did address in my written submission, is we have a concern about one of the changes in the 42A report for the city centre and similar zones like the waterfront zone, and that's the proposal that a less than qualitative assessment might be required at certain heights. So under the notified plan, the wind assessments for the city centre zone are quantitative, and the change that's sought is that for some height levels, a qualitative wind assessment would do. The concern that we have with that is there's no submission that was seeking that, so it seems to be out of scope, and it's not something that submitters could have anticipated. So my submission is that that's not a change that can be made, but as a flag, we do support the requirement for wind assessments in the high density residential zone. So I'm happy to speak further to that point or address any questions. And then the other point I'll just mention briefly is the city outcomes contribution and related issue of heights in the city centre zone. So the relief that we are seeking there is for the city outcomes mechanism to be removed, and for the height limits in CCZS1 to remain as limits or as per the notified plan. So unless you have further questions for me, I'll hand over to Mr Niven to speak to his statement on the city outcomes contribution.
I don't have any questions, but do there any in the panel at the moment? No. We'll box on.
Thank you, sir.
Ballinger.
Good morning. I'm not going to labour you with repeating everything that I said yesterday, but I am going to do a little bit of summary. There's 3 particular points I wanted to make, but first of all, just a quick summary. I've said to you that I believe this mechanism is seriously flawed to the degree that I think it should not be maintained in the plan. And the reasons for that are these. The mechanism is only activated for over-threshold buildings, which are likely to be infrequent in the life of the plan, as most of the city's increased densities are likely to fall within the 4 to 13 stories range. And I refer to Craig Stewart's evidence in front of you about a developer that's done most of the high-rise apartment buildings in the city in recent time, and that's his view about what is likely to be the bulk of height buildings, so building height in the central city in the foreseeable future. The pattern that's produced by the application of this mechanism is frankly haphazard. There's no strategic placement about it. and consequently it leads to an uneven distribution of public goods involved. Now, why that's important is that I said to you yesterday that there are a number of comments throughout the officer's reports and the draft plan itself that make it very clear that the expectation of this mechanism is very grand expectation. And I just want to quote one, I believe it's Lisa Hayes' report, or it might have been Anna Stevens, I'm not sure, but the comment that says, referring to the mechanism, it ensures that tall building, relevant zone typologies, provide beneficial public and private outcomes to contribute to well-functioning urban environment. In other words, there are these broad statements about how this is going to be an even-handed application of things that are very important to the city. And they also reiterated that they embody the city's strategic objectives around sustainability, accessibility, well, a range of things really. So I'm saying that that's fine, but the actual pattern that's produced is extremely haphazard and variable. The mechanism will not apply to building development below the threshold height. In other words, the volume and distribution of the public goods, which the plan places so much emphasis on, is likely to be very sparse. The choice of which public goods will be preferred from the public goods menu is likely to be weighted towards those qualities embedded in the construction of the building. So that won't privilege the first item on the menu, small public spaces, roof gardens, etc. Because frankly, if I was a developer, I'd be going for what I was already going to construct in my building rather than getting to the messy business of providing something on site which is separate from what I'm providing as a building. So it's my professional opinion that will probably not be emphasised in terms of the points gone for in the system. It'll be the things that are embodied in the building. Which of course, if they're achieved, meet the longevity test, which I was saying yesterday is one of the difficulties of these systems when they've been applied. So in short, the distribution of these public goods across the central city will be uneven, partial, and will be impervious to any strategic location strategy. It will not be an even-handed in a public distribution sense. The separate points that I wanted to refer to. Sorry, I'll just complete that point. So my main point is that the claims of an all-encompassing spread of public goods listed as gaining points in this incentive zoning mechanism is actually and potentially not widespread and evenly distributed as the arguments in the proposed plan suggest. Yeah, I think I've covered that. So if I go back to the points, or the specific points I wanted to make, I referred to the difficult history of these kinds of mechanisms, where even though there's a means of recording what's actually been bartered in terms of the extra development space, there seems to be a little bit of a history, not just in Wellington, because that's certainly the case here with the previous incentive zoning scheme that we referred to in the late 80s and early 90s that is no longer part of the plan. It's very difficult to find where the public goods are. In fact, one component of that earlier incentive zoning scheme was for public art, and the city sprouted a whole lot of very obvious public art applications. They had to be attached to a building within the walking environment of the city. They're all gone. There's none of them left. They've disappeared. And there was no accounting for that as far as I can tell. I've made reference to the New York experience. It was their experience too, that when they finally came to do an audit of what they actually got, this is after about 10 years of this being in place, for the bartering, they found they didn't get very much at all. They had public spaces that were not well used. They had a poor bargain, basically. They got a poor delivery. And now that's their fault for not monitoring what they got and keeping an eye on it. But I'm saying it seems to be a characteristic of this mechanism that once it's done, once the deal has been forged, nobody places a great deal of attention on the outcomes that involved. There was, I also note that in the 42A report, along with the removal of the height limits on the central city, there was also the removal of a reference to the various elements of amenity that would be applied to a building over the height limits: streetscape, visual amenity, dominance, and privacy. Now, I've had a look. I know that the design guides are being reviewed and redrafted, but I've had a look at the previous Central City design guide, and while it's full of a lot of things, to be honest, there's nothing that addresses specifically to density. You know, there are things that you can say, yes, well, that needs to be looked at in the context of density. But I would have thought, since it has that special condition in the Central City of density and its effects, that there would have been something in that design guide that specifically referred to that issue. And I rather hope that the new one will actually meet that test. That's one last point. Oh yes, so my other comments were to do with the urban design panel, and I've given you my my recipe for a successful panel. I think there's sort of 5 points, but I wanted to make just kind of run through those quickly because they are important. A panel will be used for obviously in special cases when there's something that's either too large or too challenging, or for one or some controversial reason needs to be carefully examined. Setting up a panel like this, and I've had quite a lot of experience of being on panels like this, the successful panel, it seems to me, has a group of people on it, usually about 5, no more than that, because if you get more than 5, the discussion time of the panel becomes so long that it becomes a bit dysfunctional. One of those people obviously is the chair, but their respective experience and credentials need to be approximate. In other words, they need to have roughly the same kind of level of experience and credentials, because that allows the conversation to take place seamlessly. That was certainly the case with the Waterfront Auckland's TAG, which is their panel, which is now Ike Panuku's panel. It's just transferred into that context. That's 5 people, of which I was a member up until about 3 years ago, and I've been on it for 7 years, and so did everybody else. And we had a high level of acceptance of our advice because people trusted us and because we were consistent. We put a lot of effort into being consistent, and that was appreciated by the development community. And we were told that it wasn't just sort of something that you could surmise; it was actually an opinion given us. So I think that is an important component of setting up a panel like this. The other is, to amuse you, you don't get this as a bargain basement deal. In other words, you have to pay the panel members remuneration that reflects their experience and background and credentials. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, that tends to be a point that's missed. It's somehow there's meant to be a charity function to join this panel. You're meant to be so overjoyed to be nominated that you don't have to worry about what you're getting paid. I think that's a completely unprofessional way of approaching something like this, and I believe that that's an important thing that needs to be considered in setting up a panel. That concludes what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Can I just ask some questions? That's all right. My teeth are long enough to remember all the art bonuses and things that you referred to, and I think one of the failures of that was the lack of legal protection to embed those things in place permanently by way of covenants or whatever restrictions. Could that be the way to overcome some of the issues you're concerned about there?
Yes, it could be. You could make it a much tighter deal in terms of what you've got and how long and the longevity of it. I still feel that where this particularly applies is to those public space goods that are referred to as the first item on the menu, because I refer back to what I said a few minutes ago, that I suspect they're going to become the most unattended of the menu, because it's easier for the developer to deal with the other ones, which can be seamlessly fitted into the construction of the building. So I don't expect that we're going to have them front and centre in this menu in terms of delivery.
You will realise that there's only limited scope for us to do much about urban design panels, as it's kind of basically falls outside the district plan provisions itself. Is there any advice you could provide in regard to, if you were in charge, how that could occur, how the linkages between the district plan and the urban design panel process? would occur?
I think the criteria that you're asked to address has to be really precise, and I don't think the design guide is the means to do that, because the design guide is voluminous, and each particular case that the panel would be asked to look at would be special, and it would have its own characteristics. So I would expect there'd be a lot of preparatory work done by the officers in the council in putting the terms of reference, if you like, in front of the panel. But there need to be terms of reference, because that's the other condition of consistency and confidence that you can have in the panel. It is quite clear what they are addressing. So that's important. As to the kind of issue that the city would refer the panel to, it's very difficult to speculate on a complete list of what that might be, other than it would be, we've used the loose words, important, significant, controversial, but there's a lot of things that can fall within those kind of categories. So it really is in the hands of the councillors where they choose to utilise the panel. I do think it's a very important mechanism, and I had to say that the experience in New Zealand, as I said the other day, is checkered. So where you found that the panel system doesn't work so well is where there's not been attention to the constituency of the panel. In other words, it's been used as an Auckland as a vehicle to upskill people who haven't had that experience before, which is very frustrating for people as are sitting in front of the panel to know that they've got inexperienced people in front of them who are basically learning on the job. That would be a disaster in terms of the integrity and the confidence that the development community could have in a panel. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I think my principles apply. I know that there's limited scope for you to comment on that, but they are important principles in terms of a successful panel process. One
potential mechanism is being clear about what would trigger the urban design panel's involvement, and any advice on that?
That's missing from the material in front of us at the moment, and I think that has to be clear. I know I've referred to it in other general terms, but I still think you could actually write something like that so people know when a situation would arise. It could be, for example, that there's public controversy about something. So that would be an issue that the council might decide might trigger the use of the panel, just to give extra confidence to the public that it's been seriously taken account of. Mm. I think it's when you've got something particularly large, and by large, I don't just mean tall, I mean large. It could be squat. For example, the development of the new conference centre in the city was probably an instance where a panel would have been a useful constituent in that process. I know it was a very fraught process in terms of I was an observer of the urban design process that went on that finally got to where we've got to. It wasn't easy. So I think a panel would have given a bit more authority. Quite often what happens is when you've got a single urban design practitioner who's charged with providing that advice, my observation is that if it's a very controversial project and what you're saying is somewhat unpalatable to the people that are receiving it, you can get picked off pretty easily. Whereas if it's a panel, there's a much more authoritative frame that advice has been given in. And it's been given in a public sense. That's the other thing about a panel. It doesn't happen in private, or it happens in public, and people can listen to it and see the process working.
And you've got Australian Victoria experience. Does Melbourne have a design excellence process for its large buildings and things?
It does, and I saw there was reference to that in the material that you've got. But to be honest, I don't know the detail of that. Design excellence is a very tricky word because it's actually opinion, and it's informed specialist opinion. It's not idle opinion, but so to focus on getting design excellence is a pretty fraught and difficult process, and especially if you want to attach integrity to it. You can make a list of things, but basically that's never very helpful because you're dealing with particular developments with particular issues involved. I know that in Melbourne it's come about because we had a planning minister in a coalition government, which was a one-term government, almost unheard of in Victoria, who decided it was his role in life to open the floodgates for very tall buildings. And I lived in a part of the city near Victoria Market, and I saw a photograph sent by a friend of mine the other day for that district, and I was aghast. It was full of buildings of 30 and 35 stories, and there was shadow everywhere. You know, it was a disaster. And I knew that area really well. I was really shocked to see it. So I think the design excellence move, which is a recent one in Melbourne, is probably a little bit the city trying to recover a little bit from that thing that was imposed on them. It's done a lot of damage, actually.
I have heard mixed results about it. Any questions from the panel, Mr. Niven and Mr. Ballinger? Sorry.
Follow-on discussion. Then, one of the things that I've noted is that the council have said that the urban design panel would be employed on particular significant proposals. You've just discussed what you would maybe think that those should be. You know, ones of particular public interest, something large, not necessarily high. Are those
something weird? You know, something that just the people aren't able to easily assimilate, or it threatens it's perceived to threaten some quality of the city.
And just my other question about design panels, do they often second people for particular projects?
Yes, they do. So, for example, if you had a building that you were looking at a building, say it's a tall building, and it's important to have somebody on that panel that has direct experience of the construction and had gone through the experience of procuring a building like that, because you do want to take into account the developer's experience and the circumstances they're in. That has to be part of what you evaluate. And so from time to time, it will be important to bring in somebody with particular expertise in whatever the project is in front of you. Most of the time, the people that are on that panel, if they have got the credentials and the experience I'm referring to, will cover most of that themselves through their professional careers.
But it would be helpful to have a
Yes,
provision.
absolutely. Yeah. But it's really important that they brought in as one-offs. I've been on a panel where there was a decision made outside ourselves to increase the panel because there were all sorts of other goodies that people wanted to be focused on. We had a panel of 10, and it took us days to get through things. And in fact, we had people that have been attached to the panel for a particular skill who wanted to second guess design, which they were not experienced in. So finally we got rid of it. We managed to convince everybody that this was a very bad decision, and that was quietly retired.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah, just leading on from the urban design panel, the officers have recommended as a method, a non-statutory method, that it be established. But you mentioned Takina. Okay, so I was the commissioner who approved Takina on its papers. It was a council project, so it was dealt with on a non-notified basis. So they put it as a commissioner to sign it off. Well, actually, it was a pretty straightforward exercise in the end, because you alluded to some war stories about Takina and how it got there and so forth, which certainly wasn't evident in the recommendation to me. But in terms of that particular example and your comments about it, what in terms of the outcomes for Takina would have been improved if it had gone through an urban design panel? Was it to deal with the height of it, or was it to deal with the external modulation of the facades, or what was the problem?
My view of it, what I was referring to, it's a bit like watching sausages getting made. Don't ever watch sausages getting made. So I was in the bowels of that process, and I could see the tensions that were going on. Looking at it now, I mean, I think it's actually not a bad building. You know, I'm not saying that it's a disaster by any means, but I do think that the way it engages with the street around some of its perimeters is a bit disappointing. I also think that the architectural gesture of the big canopy, I just wished it to end up being a little bit more sophisticated as a form, rather than just, you know, two signature moves and kind of what were normally described in the architectural fraternity as hero moves. You know, the idea of the mirror and the idea of the big canopy. I look at the canopy and I think it's probably not about shelter. It's more about marking entry than anything else. So there are those things that I believe. I mean, it's easy for me to say because I wasn't part of the process, but I would hope that a panel process may be attached to that, might have teased out a little bit more variation, although I know the architects involved and they're incredibly impervious to advice, usually.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm perhaps not quite as long in the tooth as the chair in terms of being in Wellington planning, but I do remember working for the council in the late 80s when the public art bonus scheme and other things was in play at the time. And my recollections is it wasn't only about public art, it was about if you did podium style development, you got approvals, and there were various other bits and bobs. And as a junior planner, I didn't get to deal with the juicy stuff anyway, but it was happening in the office at the time.
It was a three-side thing.
Yeah, yeah, and there were various different pieces of public artwork. I seem to recall the Henry Moore sculpture. They tried to find a central city site for that and couldn't, and it ended up in the Botanic Gardens.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was all. That was, you know, that was seen to be a significant coup at the time for the city in terms of getting.
Probably went for the big starfish that were on Edison Street.
Yeah,
But now
I think there is still one left.
yeah, it's attached to a building at about a third story level.
No, there's the funny little head outside in Victoria Street near the Trade Aid shop.
Okay.
There's a head on a plinth there, which I think was one of those as well.
The small public spaces, the one I do remember, which was just a disaster, was attached to the old, you know, the Black Tower, the old BNZ Tower.
Yeah.
It's on the south side, and I mean, to call it a public space, I don't think anybody's ever used it as a public space, or even conceive using it as a public space. Windy, shadows, you know, nothing to hold you there at all. So that was one of the ones we bonus.
Okay, so city moved on from that. It was, but for whatever reasons, I think the recession kicked in at the time and building development slowed significantly. So that was one of the reasons. And then it moved to the operative district plan is what we've got now in terms of the policy on design excellence. And where you did have an overhyped building, design excellence kicked in, you had to basically go through a pretty, I don't know what the term is, but it was, you could make it what you would in terms of the wording that particular policy, and you get one urban designer who thinks yes, it does design excellence, but another urban designer might say no, it doesn't and doesn't comply. So it leaves us people in a decision-making process in a real bind about what preference there is and the particular criteria that apply to that decision that is made about design excellence. With the proposed plan as it now is, there is basically a consent required for every single building in the central area, subject to some minor exceptions. Okay, mainly relating to very small scale buildings or small scale additions that can't really be seen from the public realm. But there is a process, and if you're building a new building in the central area, you have a team, you have your architect, you will often have an external urban advisor giving advice on that, so forth. And then there's the council team itself. So there is quite a, you know, I think the intention is that there's quite a lot of design focus in terms of the assessment criteria, which has flowed through to the proposed district plan. And then you mentioned the difference between the height limits in the notified plan and what are now called height thresholds. Height thresholds would act pretty much in the same way as a height limit, in that they provide an extra level of assessment required for buildings And there has been some criticism from a number of submitters that the matters in the COC contributions mechanism, that have got really nothing to do with design at all. What makes the factors, the higher parts of the building assessed under that criteria. So I'd be interested in what the options are available for the council in terms of keeping the good things that there might be in terms of city outcomes into some sort of process going forward. Is it just purely a matter of saying dispense with the city outcomes contributions completely, and those things which are specified under that, is it a matter of that, or is there any way that parts or components of the city outcomes contribution can be forwarded into an assessment criteria when it comes to consideration from a design perspective of a building which exceeds a certain height, depending on where it is?
I think that the focus has to be on the immediate tangible effects of a tall building, or something that seemed to be pushing the envelope in terms of Wellington's urban form, which is kind of what the whole thing was about, really. So I would have expected to see a particularly focused category of issue in the design guide, focused on the tall situation or the large situation. Well, you know what I think about this. I honestly don't think it's going to work, and consequently, it's going to be an awful lot of effort put into trying to make it work. But I think it's seriously flawed, and so rather than focusing on this mechanism and trying to make it work, which I don't think it will, I'd rather the focus was on the issue, which is, well, how do we brief in design terms for what our expectation is of the impact of a tall building in the city? I mean, there are a lot of things in the previous design guide which is being redrafted, which you could bring to bear on something like this. But I'm actually asking for something a little bit more focused, you know, that's actually intelligent and reflective about what the issues might be. And that's going to be important for a panel process, for example, because that will largely form the terms of reference for what they're being asked to look at. So that would be the way I go. I mean, I know it's a more traditional way of approaching things, but it does work. And I'm not seeing that focus. I mean, you know, we've spoken about the variableness, or the attempt to try and reduce the variableness of urban design assessment and advice to keep that consistency. Where you've got something that's a bit more precise to do with the effects of increased height, I think that helps that situation. The other problem that I see is that, and Lindsay, you'll know this well, that 5 or 6 or 7 people that regularly do urban design assessments for the city to do with the resource consents really ever meet. You know, we're never brought together as a group. We never have a discussion about consistency or interpretation or those sorts of things, which would frankly be helpful. But that doesn't happen. So you've got a system which tends to emphasise variableness in terms of advice, and I agree with you. That's frustrating. It's not the least for the development community that are the recipients of this.
Okay, so my next question is, you've got a list of matters in the city outcomes contribution at the moment, which I think everybody agrees are desirable outcomes in terms of a well-functioning urban environment.
They absolutely are. Yes, I agree.
There's perhaps two aspects to the question. The first is, are there, in your view, from an urban design perspective, resource management mechanisms available to achieve those outcomes? And secondly, if there's not, are there other mechanisms outside of the district plan which would make those sorts of mechanisms occur, or those outcomes which are being sought to occur? Do you understand that question?
Yes, I do. I'm not an expert in the Resource Management Act. I'm not a planner, so I don't know. You know, there's advice in the material that we've received from the officers in response to to the evidence, which says that there isn't an ability to insist on these things within the plan. I've simply taken that as read. I don't know, because I'm not an expert in that area. The second part of the question about what other means are available, and I referred briefly to that yesterday, and that is that I've had experience of city councils, and in Australia, the state government, which I know is a slightly different situation, but who have an entrepreneurial and activist involvement with the state government. It's obviously Melbourne, but other cities as well within the state, where the leverage that comes from being the governing party and all the myriad ways that you touch a community through the operation of governance, there are ways that you can begin to start to get a serious take on the delivery of things that might not be available to you through the planning system. Now, sometimes it's a competition. Sometimes it's an incredibly focused and effective communication program. Sometimes it's simply the powers that be getting together with the suppliers of materials. I mean, there's a whole range of things that can possibly be done. I was involved in a project, and I think I might have mentioned this the other day, that involved a change of mindset, and it did change it for the volume house producers in Victoria, who were not offering anything that you could call sustainable in terms of the menu of houses that you could just buy off the shelf, basically. And we invented a project to, first of all, to show them how relatively easy it was to make a house very, very environmentally responsible without it looking strange or having to have a science degree to run it. And we focused that process, which we built 5-6 houses, and we had thousands of people that went through it. And we used that as a vehicle, very targeted vehicle, to change both the delivery industry and the perception of the public who would be so what I'm saying is that there are an inventive and entrepreneurial council has probably quite a lot of unexplored measures available to it if it chose to see it that way.
Can I just make one or two comments on that in terms of the sorts of mechanisms that might achieve the city outcomes that are in the design guide at the moment. So one RMA mechanism is the volunteered condition that a developer can put up. That sort of presupposes there's already been an assessment of the height effects and that sort of thing, but a volunteered condition could be one way, and that is can be tailored in a way that's enforceable and has longevity. And then the other sorts of mechanisms are through the building consent process, and that's probably quite appropriate for the Green Star kind of considerations and accessibility considerations. And then the other things would be sorts of mechanisms that Stuart's mentioned, but also the rating system, which obviously is well out of scope for what we can look at today, but that's another avenue available to the council.
Well, I was going to ask about the rating system.
Yes.
Itself, and whether it's you, Mr. Ballinger or Mr. Niven that answers it. But you have a point scoring system. You can get a minimum of 1, or you can get a maximum of 10, without any particular guidance about whether you get the full 10 or you only get 1 or 5 or anything like that. So that is a point which has been made by a number of others as well. But if you actually look at that city outcomes contribution, I reckon, and forgetting about the Green Star building component of it, which I think is pretty well understood, is open space, public good, toilets are included component to that. So if there wasn't a resource management mechanism to achieve those city outcomes, would it mean that the community or the council or something would actually have to put its hand in its own pocket to actually provide levels of open space in the city to provide adequate levels of that for what are enabled increases, significant increases in density? Apart from the developer providing it, the developer being required to consider providing it, what is there anything else that a city can do to actually provide for that level of open space?
Well, my view is that you're right. When you get increased densities in the residential uses, the open space becomes really important because I mean there are a whole lot of different constituencies that will take up that residential offer. And they're quite distinct. So in other words, the person that's the empty nester that's left a house and garden because the kids are gone, it's very different from the young student who wants simply a place to perch. At the youth end of the spectrum, if you like, life is lived outside the apartment. So that's when these sorts of spaces become really significant. And there are different kinds of spaces. Some of them are genuinely public, everybody can get access. Some of them are actually communal, focus of a particular community associated with the residential unit, focusing on that kind of spaces there. So I do think it's for the city to take the responsibility of both strategic perspective and then delivery. It's an important city function to provide the relief means under particular developments that are really important part of the fabric. So I don't think there's any escaping from the fact that they need to be provided. I mean, for example, the city could start advocating to the development community and start looking for possibilities of site amalgamation. Site amalgamations leave the possibility for two things. You might have an existing use on the site, which is important to the city, which might be a single story operation, and you don't want to lose from the city. Or it might be that, that if you want the scope within the site to be able to have that outdoor space as part of the way the development occurs. Without an approach like that, you get what I would call plonker, which in other words, you get density, boundary to boundary, next door to each other, along, for example, a public transport route. If you had a policy, if you had a strategy which used all your various means of persuasion to advocate for site amalgamations, and look for people that were willing to do that in terms of development, then you begin to get the scope for providing that kind of space.
Just a point of information for the Commissioner. In the current Wellington City Council long-term plan, for the first time ever, there's a budget for purchasing green space in the central city.
Okay, thank you for that. We can perhaps move on to some of the other components that are in there, just briefly. I don't know how we are for time, but
Mr. Bellinger, you're also
Yes.
legal counsel for the next.
Yes.
How are we for time in terms of?
So I obviously don't want to give up time for that submitter.
I can close off the question with one more that I'm interested in, and it's in terms of the whole housing mix that there is expected in the CBD, and obviously there is a need to provide for a full range of needs, and one of the cornerstones of city outcomes contribution is in relation to assisted housing. In terms of what can you tell us what they're doing in Melbourne in terms of incentivising a greater range of housing for a greater range of people that there are in the central city?
I can tell you about a really interesting project that was really successful. When I was working with the city council, we ran a competition with a charity that was focused on homelessness. And the state government offered us a site which was right in the middle of the city. It was a good site, and we ran a competition which was both for a developer architect team. In other words, the two things had to work together. And the condition of the design of the development, the competition circumstance on the site was to provide, I think it was about 20% of the total residential offer was assisted housing. Aimed at people that were either service people in the city who were normally pushed right out to the periphery because of the cost of things, but needed to be in the centre because that's where their service was offered, or were people that were homeless. As part of the deal, the agency that was the homeless agency undertook to manage all of that. In other words, most developers were uneasy with having that component as part of their mix, because they were unfamiliar with it. They saw it as difficult and they didn't know how to manage it. So the charity took up the role and they were very experienced managing it. It was nationally and internationally publicised. It had quite serious development parties that were party to it, and the whole project was geared to changing people's opinions about what could be done, and it resulted in a measure after that of assisted housing being included, not every time, but quite often in new developments in the city. So it's another example of how skillful persuasion attached to a particular process, with all the debate that goes on around that. For example, the other partner in the process was the Age newspaper, which reported regularly on how the design groups were working and what they were finding. In other words, it became, and Melbourne design stories are popular stories. Not a week goes by when there's not a major story that you could relate to design, which is very Sydney wouldn't happen in Sydney.
But isn't the challenge for us is working out whether there should be regulation or should it be left to the encouragement or national guidance or national initiatives rather than putting something in the district plan relating to that?
I mean, regulation is obviously a sure way of beginning to achieve things like that, but my difficulty is that I'm not fully experienced in all the range of levers and mechanisms available currently within the plan or within local government practice about achieving these sorts of things. What I do know, because I've seen it time and time again, is that the City Council chooses to put a public entrepreneurial hat on. It can do a lot of things in terms of persuasion and effect, which typically doesn't happen. And that's partly because quite often there aren't the people who've got that background and experience. But when that does happen, it's amazing what you can do.
Okay. Thank you.
This is burning questions from Anna. Just one. Okay, one burning question.
One with regards to the flawed mechanism. You're saying that you don't support it because it means that the effects associated with the very tall buildings would not be directly assessed when considering a resource consent application. Now, I had that question to the council a little while ago and said, how does that work? And they said to me, no, it will definitely be assessed anyway. It's just there will be that extra layer on top. And I'm just thinking, because you pointed out in the context that CCZ 07, which deals with the adverse effects of activities and development in the city centre zone, are managed effectively, and CCZ P12, managing any associated adverse effects, for example, building dominance and so on. Would you see those objectives and policies as sufficient to ensure that all the buildings are actually assessed regardless?
It will certainly have an effect. My point I made when I made that statement in the evidence was people at the height limit also gone those 4 criteria. I was assuming that criteria was particularly devoted and focused on stuff that was over the height limit. In other words, it was that some of those special case circumstances I was referring to before. So even though I agree with you and with the officer's comments that there will be this new design guide, which we haven't seen yet, and if it's got anything to do with the previous one in terms of the material covered, it will have things that will be germane to affecting our full building. But as I said earlier, I think it's important to have a particular focus on that issue in terms of criteria that either within the design guide or in rules or that devoted to that.
For that.
Thank you, Mr. Bellinger. Keen to give time to Ms. Wong and Ms. Mackay. So
Yes, so I understand Ms. Wong and Ms. Mackay got about a 15-minute presentation. I'm aware it's going to create some timing difficulties for you potentially. So not sure how you'd like to manage that. Would you like Ms. Wong and Ms. Mackay to box on and see how we go?
Is Mr. Lamison here? Is he
Mr.
Lamison for?
No, so I wasn't intending for him to come along. He came along in hearing stream 2 with the same evidence.
Okay.
And then my client, one of the trustees of the Eldin Trust is here.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. I think we'll box on Ms. Wong if you could.
Yes.
See if you can summarise your presentation. It'll be helpful, but otherwise, the floor is yours. Okay.
Right. Good morning. I'm just going to add there's a couple more statements from our written presentation, and I'll hand out. It's just one pager, so it's just a couple of points we were going to add. One is about valuing heritage, just the general comments really, that Historic Places Wellington support the need for new development to sensitively respond and to adjoining heritage buildings, heritage areas and sites that are significant to Māori. A recent restoration of a facade at Stuart Dawson's Corner demonstrates how good design can truly enrich and delight in the cityscape experience. And Architecture Plus, the heritage consultant and the very wide project teams received several 2023 awards for this heritage project. So I think it's a great example of heritage within the city being celebrated. And so each...
There's a bit of a lag sometimes.
Yeah, that's okay. Each project concerning heritage really requires experts to oversee and explore the creation of the best response to the particular heritage site. And so I think in complicated situations, and that's where the urban design panel can step in to mediate and explore really which is the best strategy for that particular heritage. In this particular, in situations where you've got a gem like the Plymouth House, the curtilage around the site, the space around the site is really necessary, and successfully the little house lives on quite comfortably with that space, which in this case is provided by driveways actually on both sides. We move on. Another aspect in terms of urban design is really looking at view shafts, and in this one, the former Dominion Farmers Institute building is really adds to it's highlighted by the design of the new buildings adjacent. And where facadism, it might work in terms of Dawson's, but it perhaps doesn't work in the situation in Tory Street, where we've got the very characterful El Casino just swamped and a bit like some sort of remnant in a graveyard, perhaps. The other issue I'll quickly just talk about is the central city height limits, and HPW support the retention of the building height limits as notified. And because in reality, with increasing height, very tall buildings increasingly shade and create wind effects, negatively impacting on the streetscapes and the surrounding buildings. And I think a point that hasn't been talked about a lot is the fact that Wellington City Centre is built on soft sediments, going down in some cases 26 metres, and it is adjacent a major earthquake fault line. So to protect human life, very tall buildings can be designed using base isolation, but at great expense. And while occupants might be safe, they are designed so that there is significant post-quake damage and resulting occupant trauma. It can be huge. In the 2016 earthquake, I had students reporting to me that they were living on the 15th floor of Soho. They were absolutely traumatised. The internal damage to the building and the repairs to the apartments were just chaos and extensive, and they were patched up with, you know, added steel, and they are just a mess. So when we look at recently, a couple of years ago, I was in Toronto, and Toronto, Canada, where there's been a boom in these mega tall condominium towers. And it's really to house the large immigrant population. They won't be living in the towers, but the rich people will. They'll be living perhaps in the lower residential areas. In contrast to Wellington, Toronto is in a very low seismic zone. Its residents live largely indoors for 6 months of the year, which seems horrendous to us with our outdoor lifestyle. And they use in the winter underground walkways. So the main streets of Toronto, as in this photograph, are run down and dejected and just full of homeless. So these very fashionable tall buildings, these very tall buildings are fashion, I believe, but they have negative consequences. And I think the City Council has to decide whether they are for Wellington. In June this year, Paris banned new buildings above 37 metres. So, and I think that it would be poignant if the City Council can learn from these case studies. Thank you. I'll pass you over to Felicity.
Thank you. I've just come back from Dublin, which is a medium density city. Doesn't have tall buildings at all, and it's a very pleasant place. Just to add a bit of a highlight of some 4 heritage sensitive areas near the city centre or Newtown Centre. I just want to mention that as regards Thorndon, we do not support the changed zoning from residential to city centre for 2 small enclaves of wooden houses that have very high primary character assessment by Bofema School, and that's Selwyn Terrace area there in the map, and also Portland Crescent and Hawkstone Street nearby. And the rationale from Mr. Lewandowski, who recognises the degree of primary significance or primary quality of these wooden houses, is that, you know, that there's small enclaves within the city centre, but we don't believe that that's sufficient rationale to include them in the city centre zone without character protection. Our contention is that qualifying matters exist in relation to these areas, and you can see them in the Bofema School 2019 recommendations. And also in the 2007 Bofema School recommendations about Thorndon, these areas were proposed as heritage areas. Now, it was as a result of what the residents wanted elsewhere in Thorndon that they became character areas, and we do support that as our primary request. You can see photographs of these areas here. Similarly, for an area on the terrace, we believe this area is proposed to go into central city zoning out of residential currently. It's currently a character area. There's 10 listed heritage sites in this small area at the intersection of the terrace and Salamanca Road. It's of, I believe, national significance. These old houses in which New Zealand politicians lived in the early days of New Zealand's provincial government and the development of our country. We reject the evidence that these are, you know, separate from areas of character precinct as being a sufficient basis to decline to accept qualifying matters exist for these areas. the areas have had a long established character recognised in the operative district plan, and they're worthy of protection on a site-by-site evidential basis, and that is shown in the Bothamiskal work that we talked about in Stream 2. We presented evidence from earlier council assessments about the Thorndon areas in particular, and we think that that evidence should be taken into account. Turning to a small area in Mount Victoria, Lippman and Levy Street, we believe that these areas on the edge of the city centre zone also have significant character and heritage values that should be recognised. And again, we reject the idea that just because they're on the edge of the city centre zone, that somehow or other that diminishes their character or heritage. We refute the evidence that says the character of the areas is variable or detractive. And in the case of Lippman, of course, it's this one-sided argument. You know, it's one side of the street that's primary and the other side is CCZ. So there's a problem with the methodology. It did not contain a robust evidential basis for excluding areas merely because of their proximity to the CCZ, and bearing in mind, or being near and therefore more likely at risk, should rather strengthen the protection that they have rather than diminish it. They're of outstanding character unique to Wellington. Turning to Newtown Centre, we support the heritage overlay or the heritage designation of the Newtown Shopping Centre, which is an existing protection. And we see value, though, in aggregating heights around the rear of the shopping centre and away from the nearby residential area. And that involves adaptively reusing the heritage shops by stepping development back from Ridderford Street, which is a narrow street. And in this regard, we very much support the proposals of Red Design and the Newtown Residents Association Group and others. And also, we would add that Newtown is a commuter and transport destination, but density, quote, commensurate with its services is not as justified as some other centre areas. Although it's got high employment related to health, a lot of the employees don't use the second-hand shops and the cafes and bars of Newtown itself. They rather go point to point and return to their other suburbs. I think if you look at the evidence of the nature of the services that Newtown has, it's not commensurate with very tall buildings. Historic Places Wellington is also concerned about the wind effects of taller buildings in Newtown on the heritage shopping precinct itself. And then we would just say that there's some very high areas of character and heritage value in the neighbouring streets, Emmett and Green Street, which are two small streets I think either you or at least other commissioners have visited that go off Ridderford Street, and the proposal is to add those streets to the Newtown Heritage Shopping Area. And we refute the evidence that says the character of the area is sufficient to extend the nearby character precincts, or to extend the heritage area to inappropriate, is inappropriate. And that was something, you know, we don't agree with the council on. The council said that for these other areas of Normanby Street and Donald McLean Street at the south end of Newtown, they said that if you recognise the character and heritage of these, you would have these sort of fingers of protection poking into, if you like, the Newtown Centre. But we don't agree that that's a sufficient basis for not accepting the evidence of the character, significant character, and the heritage of Normanby Street and Donald MacLean Street, two of the very oldest streets in Newtown that deserve protection. Thank you.
Any questions? Very clear. Thank you very much for your presentation. And has a copy been sent to Jazz of this thing? Yes.
Yes, there is, and I've got this additional one here of the points I raised before.
Okay, thank you. That would be great.
The slideshows on the Stream website. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Ballinger, sorry, you're going to change hat now.
Yes, thank you. I will, and I apologise for a slight overrun there.
No, that's all right.
So I am also counsel for the Eldin Family Trust. So change over to that hat.
Okay, we have read the circulated visa submissions.
Thank you. So I'm here with Sir Douglas White, who is one of the trustees and a resident of Selwyn Terrace. I just thought I'd outline the relief that the trustees are seeking, in particular in relation to this hearing stream. The primary relief we are seeking is that Selwyn Terrace is taken out of the city centre zone and placed into a residential zone. And we covered in hearing stream 2 what type of residential zone that should be. The second alternative relief we are seeking is for a specific height control for Selwyn Terrace if you decide that it should remain in the city centre zone, and that is due to the impacts on the protected U shafts. And you've seen the visual material from Mr. Mallison on that. So I'll just speak briefly to those two submission points. So the reasons why we say Selwyn Terrace should not be in the CCZ is, having reviewed the council's material, we don't consider that there's been an adequate justification for that significant change from the current operative in a residential zoning and a long established pattern of residential use in Selwyn Terrace. The national policy statement requires there to be sufficient development capacity, and so that gives you a guidance on how large the city centre zone needs to be. The evidence from the council is that there is already sufficient residential and business land, so there's no justification there to expand the city centre into Selwyn Terrace and other isolated parts of Thorndon. There's also some difficulties with Selwyn Terrace being in the city centre zone, and you'll have seen photos in my submissions of the narrow and steep access. Just a few blocks away, which is, as I understand it, currently to remain as a residential zoned area. So that's just a summary of our points as to why city centre zone is inappropriate. The alternative submission is for a specific height control for Selwyn Terrace. And this one way of achieving that sort of height control is for the view shaft provisions to apply, and then there was some discussion about that in hearing stream 3, so I don't propose to repeat that. But one possible outcome that the hearing stream 3 commissioners might come to is that there is not scope to extend the view shafts to apply into residential zones. We say that, so if Selwyn Terrace is to remain in the city centre zone, then the view shafts logically will apply in that spatial extent of Selwyn Terrace. If they don't, then the alternative is to have specific height controls for buildings in Selwyn Terrace, and Ms Stevens in her section 42A report supports that as an alternative protection. And it's important just to clarify what we're trying to protect there, and that is the views towards Te Ahumairangi Hill as the backdrop to the Houses of Parliament and the Beehive. That's a recognised significant, nationally significant view, and so there ought to be some measure of protection for that against it being encroached or intruded upon by tall buildings in Selwyn Terrace. So those are the key points I wanted to highlight from our written materials and the relief that we are seeking, and the issues that the submitter has raised obviously are over a couple of hearing streams, so they do need to be looked at in an integrated way to ensure that that protection of that view shaft is provided by the new plan. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Ballinger?
I was just looking at the Ms Stevens rebuttal. She's suggesting that perhaps a height limit of 22 metres, which is 6 stories, and you've suggested 11.
Yes.
Could you just give me a little bit more about why you've come up with 11? I think that that's appropriate.
Yes, so that's, I suppose, for so it needs to be less than 6, because that 6 is around about where you start to intrude into the view shaft, and so you need to look at the impacts on the view. So we say 6 is too high. 11 was put forward because of sort of consistency with the current level of residential land use in Selwyn Terrace.
No, I don't have any questions. Your submission is very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and attending.
All right. Thanks very much. You wanted to say? No?
Mr. Palmer, would you like to come up to the table, please? Yeah. Firstly, I want to thank you for your patience and your flexibility. Very much appreciated. But you probably found some of that previous presentations of interest to you as well.
Very, very much.
Yeah.
Identifying particular houses even.
Right.
So I think it's nice.
Okay. So the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes. So. Yep.
Yeah, just press that one.
So it's green. Great, thank you.
So the first issue of concern is the lack of public involvement in decisions made in issuing resource consents, and there seems to be a trend where the public are exiled from the process. The national policy statement reduces substantially a lot of local participation and local knowledge, and that's something I want to give some emphasis to, that in Wellington, local knowledge is incredibly important. And if, in my view, officials, when they're exercising their discretionary powers, if they don't have access to the local knowledge of those that live in a particular area, they cannot make a legitimate decision because they cannot have access to all the potential adverse effects. So what is the solution? There is an informal process within the council. It's called registering as interested parties, and it's not widely known. But if that process was strengthened and made more of a formal framework within the council's decision-making process, then it has the potential to enable officers to have specific local information before arriving at a decision. So the next topic I want to cover is verandas. It's one of my hobby horses. And my understanding is that on the main north-south corridors going through the city, that over time verandas will be in place, that they're mandatory. That's Kent and Cambridge, Tory Street, Victoria Street, Water Street, etc. But one of the deficiencies in terms of pedestrian amenity in particular is the east-west streets stretching from Cambridge to Tory and Tory through to Taranaki and Taranaki beyond. And this, I think there's more people living within the city and living within much smaller spaces. The pedestrian thoroughfares of the city are going to be more and more important. And they also have the potential, if well designed, they have the potential to provide some safety during earthquakes if the verandas can be strong enough to cope with falling glass, etc. And I would like to see within the district plan specific design guidelines just for verandas. And I've spoken to some engineers who agree that it's possible with heritage buildings within the inner city, particularly places like Cuba Street, is that the veranda can be used to reinforce the facade behind it. And that's, sorry, I'm experiencing long COVID, so I have episodes of brain fog. Anyway, that's all I want to say on verandas. The next issue is the Centreport inter-island terminal to be built at Kaiwharawha. And I know there's been a resource consent issued for that project by the Emergency Protection Authority. It was a fast track process. But I think that there should be something in the district plan that gives protection over a much longer period of time to the Kaiwharawha stream and estuary. It's ecologically, it's a very, it's one of the prime features of Wellington Harbour. The catchment strip for that stream stretches from Karori right through to Niu. And I've spent some time with the Civic Trust helping clear up that area with rubbish, etc. And I think it's an area that needs to be treated with a great deal of sensitivity and scientific knowledge as regards protecting the ecology of that estuary and the stream. And I'm not confident that the resource consent that's been issued will cover that entirely.
Mr. Brown, if I could just stop you there.
Yes.
I believe, and Ms. Stevens might clarify this
Yes.
for me, that that is a subject to a separate hearing coming off at the court.
Correct, I think
And
it's
then-
hearing stream 7 potentially.
Yes,
so
hearing
not-
stream
not for a
7.
while.
So I'll take on board what you said
Yeah.
because there is a centre zone that also covers part of the stream catchment. So I'll
Okay.
take that on board.
Okay,
Thank you.
right. The only other thing I'd like to talk about is the town belt. I was a founding committee member of the Friends of the Town Belt, which sadly is fallen into recess. But we campaigned quite strenuously for some 20 years to have new legislation to protect that feature of the city. And what has happened since is that a lot of the decisions about the putting in tracks and other facilities in the town belt have been decided by council officers without public participation. And I would like to see something in the district plan that ensures that new tracks are subject to notification, and that even more particular commercial activity, it's evident that that the council has been faced with more and more proposals to have commercial activity on the town belt, and they haven't fully developed a concession policy. And I think it would be helpful if the district plan has provision that any commercial activity on the town belt is to be publicly notified.
Well, I'll just also highlight that I think
Yes.
town belt is a subject of another hearing coming up. Can you-
7 or 8, I think.
7 or 8.
Probably
So
next year.
it may mean you returning to those particular
No,
hearings because
I-
I may or may not be on them or
Yes.
this panel.
No, I've made the written submission anyway.
Yeah.
And
Yes, you
I don't
have.
think there's any point in me.
Well, I'm sure the
Yes.
officers here have heard your comments as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
For that, any questions for Mr. Palmer? No? All very clear. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Palmer, for
Thank
coming.
you.
Again, thank you for your flexibility.
Okay.
Yep, all the best. Ms. Mallison?
Yes.
Would you like to come to the table? Well, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I might just bring your further submission up in front of me. Have you got any written statements?
Well, I have got a written statement, yes,
Okay, if we could have a copy of that afterwards, that'd be fantastic.
yes,
Thank you.
yes, certainly.
Okay,
I'm just back from the UK, actually 24 hours, so I have only got one copy of the statement, but I'll make certain that Jazz might be able to
yeah, I'm
photocopy
sure
it
she
for me.
will. Thank you.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
I just want to say that I don't represent any organisation. I don't, I'm just speaking for myself. I've lived in Wellington for 65 years and I know the place pretty well. I personally think that Wellington is going to be ruined if developers are given free rein to build where and how they wish. The character homes are an important part of the attraction of Wellington, to tourists and to others. I've heard many tourists say that. The small character precincts at present envisaged must be much larger. The assumption that we will have 80,000 extra residents in the coming years is based, as far as I know, on research done before the COVID epidemic. It's now generally agreed that these figures no longer apply. I have to say I find it ludicrous to allow developers to build without a requirement not to intrude on the sunlight of neighbouring buildings. The extra heating that will be used by the affected buildings will badly affect our carbon emissions. I'm afraid that's the limit of my submission. Thank you.
Well, that's right, thank you. Just looking at your further submission too here. So, any questions for Ms. Mallison? No, you made very precise and concise submission. So thank you very much, Ms. Mallison.
Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you. I believe that's all the submitters. Yes, we have for hearing stream 4. So on that matter, we will look towards how we organise ourselves for the wrap-up hearing in terms of letting the submitters know and having a part in that process if they wish. But we can come back to you on that. So unless there's any other procedural matters, I'll call the hearing and adjourn it. So thank you everybody for your participation.